start introducing people for coming here tonight, because what I know about the attachment to all the behaviors and addictions that are killing so many of our people. My nephew died last year at age 23 following some complications from his addiction. And so it hits home, and I have children in recovery, and I know the power of the community, and I know the power of prayer. And so if you're struggling while you're here tonight, believe that there is hope, there is a solution out there, and that if you pray like I did, that God will lead you in the right direction. So never, never, never give up, okay? And a gentleman who has never given up on this issue is our first speaker tonight. He is Dr. Kenison Roy. I call him a friend as well. He's just a wonderful person. He's Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Tulane, and he's got this special program where he's training doctors in addiction medicine. Addiction medicine, right? He's a distinguished fellow of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. He's certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, the American Board of Preventive Medicine and Addiction Medicine, and the American Board of Addiction Medicine. He is a member of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, the American College of Psychiatrists, the American Medical Association, and past president of the Louisiana Psychiatric Medical Association. But mainly what he's been is he's used his brain, his resources, his knowledge, and his heart to help others who are struggling with this. So please welcome Dr. Ken Roy.
Thank you, Mary Lou. My timer up here so that I don't overstay my welcome. So that's good. My name is Ken Roy. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm an addiction medicine specialist, and I'm a person in long-term recovery from addiction. So addiction is a really, really difficult disease. And it has really good people doing things that violate their own conscience and their own will, including using. And sometimes it's hard to love somebody with addiction. Very often it's hard to like somebody with addiction. But if you want to know what somebody with addiction looks like, you're looking at them. Addiction is not necessarily a fatal disease. Many people with addiction, in fact, because they have addiction, are required, if they want to stay sober, to work a program of self-examination, self-exploration, and personal improvement that makes them better than they ever would have been if they didn't have addiction. So let me tell you a little bit about what addiction is. Addiction is a family disease. I have rarely, if ever, run into anybody who developed addiction in isolation. Addiction is the kind of family disease that makes everybody in the family sick from the addiction. People who support, enable, love, care for somebody with addiction develop their own illness around that same disease. And it's important for the person who needs to be in recovery, for the family members to also recognize that they need to be in recovery and to be proactive in doing so. Mechanisms for doing that include professional treatment, but also include Al-Anon and Nar-Anon, or Narcanon. So addiction also is primarily a genetic disease. 60% of the etiology or the cause of addiction is genetic. And 40% is what happened to you growing up. Very famous Nobel Prize winner, T.K. Lee, once said that beginning to use substances has a lot to do with who you're with and who your peer group is. But developing addiction is primarily a genetic condition. So what is this genetic condition? It's hard to measure. At least right now, we don't have the tools to identify somebody with addiction before they start behaving addictively and before they develop a cellular dependence on drugs of addiction. So, in retrospect, people who have addiction that I've treated all these years tell me, and I also recognize this about me, that prior to first use, my experience of life was that I was restless, irritable, and discontent. That's hard to measure because people have pretty good defense mechanisms, but it's there. And that's the condition that requires treatment. I'll tell you what's easy. What's easy is getting somebody comfortably and safely off of drugs. It's a piece of cake. It's simple, it's rewarding, I like to do it, but it's not treatment for addiction. Treatment for addiction is that process of examining restless, irritable, and discontent and figuring out what contributed to that and doing the best we can to move on from there and change and be different. So when somebody has addiction, the primary symptom of that disease is that that disease tells the person with addiction that he doesn't have a disease. Addiction lies to the person that has it. Minimizes, rationalizes, intellectualizes, and develops all of these thought processes that help people believe they don't have a disease or it's not bad enough and that they can continue to use. So the early treatment of addiction is heavily weighted on the attention to denial. And once somebody gets over their denial in their recovery program, in the first 3 steps of a 12-step recovery program, once they get over their denial, then they can start seeing, okay, I need to change, I need to be different, and I need to get well. Self-centeredness is the root of our problems. It's a quote from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And self-centeredness may or may not be there prior to first use. Self-centeredness is a direct result of using drugs to the point that you become dependent on the drugs that you're using. And people can only think about me, 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 me. And that's hard to break. And it doesn't happen often in individual interactions. So I've been a doctor for a long time. I've treated a lot of people with addiction. And I'll tell you that what I say to people is not as important as what their peers say to each other and them in the context of professional treatment or in the context of 12-step recovery groups. So if I tell somebody that they have addiction and that they need to do this and that, sometimes they'll listen to me. Most often, they'll go out and do what they've been doing, and then I end up seeing them sometime later, and they tell me, well, I wish I would have done what you told me to do. But the information that people with addiction get from their peers, who are also in recovery or trying to be in recovery, is much more valid to the person with addiction than what I say. Now, I'm a scientist. I get too full of talking about neurotransmitters and what happens in the brain and so forth. Really what happens when peers talk to each other is they call each other on their stuff. So that's not true. I just saw you do this, and now you say this. And that's easier for a peer to do than for me to do. So the only rational goal for treatment for addiction is abstinence from addicting drugs and recovery from the disease of addiction. I'm on time. There is a question around. Well, my son, husband, sister is an opiate addict, and the doctor prescribed Suboxone. So, is that abstinence? And to tell you the truth, it actually is abstinence. It's not substituting one drug for another. It is abstinence by its very definition. People who are prescribed Suboxone don't behave addictively around Suboxone.
The mic went off.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. People who are prescribed Suboxone do not behave addictively around Suboxone. They don't take more than is prescribed unless it's not enough. Unless not enough is prescribed, and they feel comfortable. They don't have withdrawal symptoms. Now, some people who are prescribed Suboxone, if they have been involved in antisocial behavior and with an antisocial peer group who are only prescribed Suboxone, they will act antisocially. They will take two and sell one. They will put it on the street. They will buy and sell other drugs. They will sell it so that they can get some other kind of drug. But that's the difference between being abstinent and in treatment and in recovery and just being prescribed a pill. I think an analogy is diabetes. You know, sometimes doctors do this, but if somebody has a BMI is a measurement of body weight index. If they have a BMI of 40 and their blood sugar is 600, sometimes a doctor will give them medicine just so that they stay alive long enough to hopefully get involved in recovery and lose weight and exercise and do those things that a diabetic needs to do. And I think that same thing applies to the harm reduction end of the spectrum of treating people with addiction. You can't treat dead people. Once somebody rotates off planet, they're gone. Nothing I can do can help them. But if they stay alive long enough, and if they're comfortable long enough to recognize how disturbed and dysfunctional their life has become, then they quite frequently come in and say, okay, I'm ready for treatment. So the only rational goal for treatment is abstinence and recovery. But there's a whole spectrum of things that are legitimate attention to addiction along that spectrum, including safe needle programs, Narcan, and other harm reduction strategies. So there's a whole lot of things that can be done. Let me switch over to talk about a little bit of what's out there. Alcohol and alcoholism is still the largest drug-related cause of death and disability other than nicotine. So alcohol kills more people than our current rate of overdose deaths every year. And it's been doing that for hundreds of years. So let's not discount alcohol. Alcohol is a serious and severe problem, and it's one that's very, very difficult to get well from. Before I came into recovery, they didn't have seltzers, they didn't have Jägermeister, they didn't have all of those things that are more attractive to people that get them started and get them to using alcohol. We live in a culture where drinking is part of the culture, and you're kind of supposed to do it. And so that's a difficult thing to get over and get through. But alcohol hasn't really changed that much in the last 50 years, or the people with addiction to alcohol and what their needs are. With the exception with this pandemic, we have seen a huge relapse rate for people that were previously in recovery, and we've seen an acceleration of the development of addiction involving alcohol related to the pandemic and the social isolation. Back in the 80s, when I started doing this, there were alcoholics, marijuana addicts, and heroin addicts, and then there was a cocaine epidemic. So we had a few drugs. Cocaine for a long time was considered a recreational drug, even by the government, and until people started developing very severe problems and injecting the cocaine. But it was relatively simple back then. We knew what was out there, we knew how to test for it, we knew how to monitor for it, and it was easy. But about 6 years ago, this whole scene changed. And there was not only the legalization of marijuana in Colorado, and I can't tell you how many of my patients have driven to Colorado, and some very horrific kind of consequences from the dabs and the edibles and all of that kind of thing. But also, we had the opioid epidemic, where the Sackler family pushed OxyContin on all of the population, lied to doctors to say that OxyContin wasn't addicting, and influenced by paying lobbyists lots of money, the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Healthcare Institutions to identify pain as a fifth vital sign, so that it became necessary, in fact, legally required for doctors to treat pain, and the treatment of pain was opiates. And our understanding was very simple and simplistic and didn't make any distinction between acute pain and chronic pain. And it was the chronic pain that caused the opioid epidemic. And then all of a sudden everybody says, whoa, this isn't working. This is bad for people. So you have to stop prescribing OxyContin. And so there was a very precipitous, very sudden drop-off in the prescription of opiates to people with chronic pain. And so guess what they did? They went out on the street. And once they went out on the street and they started getting stuff, they started interacting with people who were using needles, and there was a huge increase in intravenous drug abuse. And then, shortly after that, and I say 6 years ago, that was probably 10 years ago, but about 6 years ago, we started seeing fentanyl on the street. And fentanyl is a drug that's used in surgery because it's very, very powerful. It's used as a general anesthetic. So you go to surgery, they put some fentanyl in your vein, and you die, except they put a tube in your throat to breathe for you so you don't die. And so fentanyl is a very, very powerful drug. And the suppliers, the drug pushers, the overseas manufacturers who were selling heroin began putting fentanyl in the heroin. And actually some addicts, some people with addiction, sought out the dealers that had fentanyl in their heroin because they thought it was a better high. And we started seeing the overdose rate increase and increase and increase. Well, how that evolved is that now there's fentanyl in everything. There's fentanyl in cocaine, there's fentanyl in methamphetamine, there's fentanyl in anything you can buy on the street. And there are pills that are pressed in these overseas factories to look like Vicodin or Norco or some relatively harmless drug that are pure fentanyl. You take one and you die. And so we saw 105,000 overdose deaths in the 10 months that ended in October. And I'm sure that that number is continuing to increase. So it's a very dangerous place. It's a very dangerous time. And there's been a lot of attention and a lot of money that's gotten thrown at this opioid overdose epidemic. Unfortunately, not very much of that money has gotten aimed at professional treatment for addiction. And because addiction is a disease, professional treatment is almost always necessary. There are some people that walk into the doors of NA or AA and find a way to achieve abstinence. But unless they are vigorous, painstaking about working their 12-step program, they never get to the place about change, about being different so that I don't use, about doing something today so I don't use tomorrow. And so all of this money goes around to public information and so forth. And all of that is good, but not enough is being directed towards the treatment industry so that if somebody wants treatment for addiction, they have to go to a place that accepts Medicaid and is budgetarily challenged because their patients pay for the services with Medicaid, or they pay out of pocket. And paying out of pocket to a good treatment center is $1,200 a day. So it's a really difficult situation. And the solution is there. Oops. The solution is there, and that is to do your best to access the best treatment possible and to support each other, family members and loved ones, in participating in an ongoing process of recovery, a process of living life differently and becoming different because of that. So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to the next speaker, and I'll be able to entertain questions after that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. I know that's a hard topic to cover in 15 minutes, but I wanted to share, because he reminded me, prior to COVID, I was teaching the brain science of addiction prevention on a federal grant in some public schools, and in one school of high schoolers, I had been in there several weeks, and I had taught them that alcohol and marijuana are often the gateway drugs that lead to other drugs because the brain gets used to that drug and needs a greater high, and that marijuana is often laced with fentanyl. And this little girl in the front of the class said, "I don't believe any of that." And this other girl who never said anything in class raised her hand, and she shared with us, she said, "I had two friends who had never smoked marijuana before, and somehow they got a marijuana cigarette, and when the first child took a puff, he died instantly because they found out that it was laced with fentanyl. And then another boy in the back of the classroom raised his hand. He said, I just got out of rehab. And I said, well, can I ask you about that? He said, sure. I said, what did you go in for? And he said, heroin. I said, you were shooting up? He said, yes. I said, did you begin with heroin? He said, no, I began with alcohol. I said, and then what did you use? He said, I began using marijuana. And then what? Pills. And then eventually it led to shooting up. I said, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you just stick with the marijuana or the pills? He said, because the high wasn't strong enough anymore and I needed something stronger. And so these kids are really faced with a lot. Our next speaker faced a lot as well, and I don't think I really have to say much about him. How many of you have seen the Netflix series, The Pharmacist? So he's a household name now. I'm sure he'd much rather not have to have gone through what he went through to become a household name, but in 1999, his son Danny, at 22 years of age, was killed in a drug buy, and he spent the last more than 20 years now trying to help other people realize what's going on out there. I used to see him long before his Netflix series at training sessions and things I was at. So please welcome Dan Schneider.
All right. Yeah, I'm Dan Schneider, and I never wanted this notoriety. Okay, but if it helps save a life, it's all worth it. Very early after my son, and we were surprised, we didn't know he had any addiction issues other than he occasionally smoked marijuana. And then he gets murdered attempted by crack in a lower ninth ward. And I didn't know much about addiction, even though I was a pharmacist. I had to learn it, okay? But I also felt he deserved some measure of justice. The stigma had made it so that the cops thought it was another drug deal gone bad, and didn't really care about his life, okay? But as we all know, it has been mentioned already, these are real people that all start off as good people, okay? And there's a lot of factors, and we now know genetics is part of it, environment is part of it, trauma is part of it, peer pressure is part of it, okay? That doesn't really have anything to do with the morality that's involved in attempting or trying drugs. And then lots of times the drugs lead to places where they don't know where they're going, and they may have that addictive personality, and it starts off that way. So again, most of y'all have seen the show. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but you know, after actually while I was solving my son's murder, walking the streets of the Ninth Ward because to do the job that the police should have been doing, they treated my son pretty much like his killer, another criminal. And so one criminal killing another criminal. Drug users, most of them aren't criminals, other than the criminality of the drugs. And I'm not for legalization of drugs, but when you're using drugs, it's a different kind of criminality. It's not what we think of, okay? It's not going out there and stealing from somebody. So they definitely deserve empathy and love and care. And Dr. Roy's right. It's hard that many times to like them or love them. But that's one big part of the solution, to keep loving them, okay? As I was solving my son's murder, I began to see young kids come in with opioid prescriptions. And believe it or not, I wanted to try to start doing something about that. And I had thought about talking in high schools and all about signs for parents, and keep talking to your children about drugs, and anything that I could do to try to reduce the tragedy that befall in my family. But I was so busy with the case that I really couldn't get to it. I couldn't focus on it. And I learned how to be you might say a detective, I guess. And as soon as my son's case was solved, I went and spoke at his high school. And I originally set out to really not do any more investigation, okay? I people look at me as some vigilante type of pharmacist, okay, and then became an investigator, which that did happen, okay, but that was not my intention at first. My intention was to go out and educate and make people aware and educate and try to make people more empathetic with people who do drugs. You know, plenty of these people die. Some of them commit suicide. While I was later on, when I used to write articles in the paper, I'd have parents call at their wits' end and say, "Could you help me?" And I did a little bit of personal work. I really admire Dr. Roy for this because I tried to do a little bit of, you might say, treatment, psychiatric work, and I worked with about a dozen kids on and off. And long story short, I wasn't very good at it. It's a difficult thing to do. I was not that experienced at it. Most of those kids are dead now, okay? I don't think it was my fault because a lot of people had tried before I did. But one of the sad things was that happened, just to show you how hard it is for people to give up drugs. And even when they give up drugs, how difficult the situation can be. One of my success stories, I had a couple of success stories, by the way, okay, but one of my success stories was a kid that, man, always bragged about me. He was always saying, "You saved my life." And he was an inspiration because rarely do you get the pats on the back, okay? You know, after the documentary, I got pats on the back, but the first 10, 15 years before that story came out, I didn't get a lot of pats on the back, okay? But anyway, this kid always patted me on the back. And then one of his friends, who was another kid that helped survive, okay, called me up one day and we were talking, and I said, "Well, how's, I'm going to use a different name now, how's Bruce doing?" And he said, "Oh, you didn't hear about Bruce?" I said, "No, what?" He says, "He committed suicide." I said, "What happened?" He got married and he had a kid and he was fully recovered and he was one of my best examples out there, one of my best stories. Well, his wife left him and they had some real serious problems, and he thought about going back to drugs. He chose to kill himself first. I say it, I don't think you should be killing yourself. You should be fighting. There's always hope. There's always hope. But anyway, what I started seeing in my drugstore was young kids that looked like my son, 22 years of age, and I'd always seen people that come in the drugstore with opioid prescriptions. Sometimes we would run them off, and sometimes we would talk to them, and sometimes we would fill a prescription just to you know, I called them almost like drugstore addicts. But most of them weren't selling drugs. Most of them had some type of impairment, okay? Most of them were, 35, 45, 55 years of age. All of a sudden, I saw something different. I seen some of them, but I also see 18-year-olds, and 20-year-olds, and 25-year-olds, okay? And most of them didn't have any impairments, okay? And again, as the story goes, there was a doctor in our area that was supposedly the most notorious pain clinic doctor, Belleville doctor in the New Orleans area. And she was right next to St. Bernard Parish where I lived. And a lot of kids would go over there and get these prescriptions and bring them back. And I started a crazy story, open up all hours of the night, only takes cash. If you pay more, you get faster service. And I had to table my education efforts because I saw a greater need there. At first I talked to the police and tried to motivate them. Nothing worked. So again, I took it upon myself to go out and do that. And I managed to get this doctor shut down. But you know what? That didn't totally solve the problem at all. Okay? Now, I will say something too. I was also an advocate to reducing help create the pharmacy monitoring program. I want to try stopping doctors shopping, and we didn't want these doctors writing out for moderate pain. The OxyContin prescription was supposed to be for cancer and for very serious pain. Even in most cases, for chronic pain, the effect of it doesn't last forever, and there's a lot of side effects to it. Okay, so I advocated the tightening up of the prescription opioids. And in the doctor's years, I kind of mentioned a little bit of mixed feelings about that because, as we all know now, a lot of people went to heroin, and then now with fentanyl, they went to fentanyl, and the rate of death is higher. But I want us to keep in mind here that, because in my experience as a pharmacist in the counter, when we started restricting the prescription opioids, okay, some people gave up opioids, okay, and we kind of forget about that, okay. Next thing that happened is we stopped creating addicts. Young kids with minor accidents going in there and getting OxyContin and getting hooked because they started on these things while they were waiting to get their settlement checks. Okay. So we started reducing less addicts. And we started cutting back on diversion because you couldn't get sufficient quantities. Okay. Maybe you could furnish your own habit, but you didn't have enough to sell. Okay. So we started curtailing diversion. So there was some good and bad in that reduction in the prescription opioids, okay? But I want to keep in mind now, if we hadn't reduced those prescription opioids, okay, the rate of death compared to the number of addicts out there is greater because they're going to street drugs, absolutely. But if we had 2 or 3 times as many addicts, which really, if we kept going the way we were going with the prescription opioids, okay, we'd have 2 or 3 times that many. And most of those eventually that stayed on the prescription opioids long enough, they turned to heroin anyway. So I have a little bit of mixed feeling, but I don't think that we can directly say that cutting down on the opioids was a big part of the issue. Okay. Now, other things have influenced the rise. Okay, COVID. Okay, you don't have the socialization. You don't have the access to treatment that maybe you once had. Okay, and so I've had to evolve in a lot of ways. I was one of these advocates at one time that said that I had kind of mixed feelings in Suboxone. Even though early on in my career I started people in Suboxone and I had about a third of them actually succeed, which I now know that's great statistics, but that was still depressing to me. Okay, and I started hearing about it being diverted. Someone would sell it on the street and whatnot, and I started hearing negatives. What looked like it was going to launch into a real advocacy for real treatment. Like Dr. Roy says, this is a real treatment for addiction. This is just not swapping the one drug for another. Okay? And so I and a lot of people somewhere along the way kind of got sidetracked, and we didn't really use it that much. And when you had a fairly small rate of death and reducing number of addicts perhaps, okay, there are better treatments. Maybe Suboxone can be part of it, but there are actually a lot of good treatments. There's a lot of good spiritual treatments. There's a lot of good church recovery centers. There's a lot of Narconon and Al-Anon, and there's 12-step programs, okay? There's a lot of potential solutions, okay? But now with this 105,000 overdose deaths, I'm starting to advocate Suboxone. It's a medication. When a person's on it, their head gets right. They're more apt to actually want to go to maybe church or listen to a priest or listen to a rabbi or listen to a minister, okay? They're more apt to go see Dr. Roy, okay? So I really would like y'all, if it ever comes to it, to speak up for Suboxone. I really believe we can start reducing and saving a lot of lives, okay? The other thing about it is Suboxone does get diverted, okay? And one of the reasons why it gets diverted is it's not really easy to get Suboxone. It's still easier to get a prescription opioid than it is to get Suboxone. I don't know the stigma involved in it, or this confusion about what it is, or it's just another drug, okay? But it's really not there where it's needed. So some people buy it on the street. Second thing is, though, people don't really like prescription drugs being sold on the street. So that was another negative about Suboxone that I think curtailed its activity. But in reality, when you think about it, even when it's diverted, and I don't really recommend that, wish it perhaps didn't happen, okay, because they're not going to be in any care at all of any doctor when they buy it on the street. But why do they buy it on the street? It doesn't really give you much of a high. So they're not trying to buy this drug on the street to get high. What it does is it prevents withdrawals. What it does is it prevents cravings. What it does is it's a safe drug that's not going to be laced with fentanyl. So I really think we really have to advocate for that. Another couple of things that I'd like to mention to y'all, okay, is harm reduction. And I believe actually Suboxone can be harm reduction along with a lot of the things that Dr. Roy discussed, okay? But there's other things, the drug buyback programs that you turn in your old drugs, it's a good idea. Believe it or not, a lot of kids in their own home actually will experiment with your own prescription medications, which is double bad now because they might try a Percocet that you had left over, okay? And boy, we thought that was really bad, okay? But it didn't contain fentanyl and it didn't kill them. But when they couldn't get that anymore, okay, they might buy one online. Only it wasn't really Percocet. Now, I'm not advocating keeping Percocet in your tablet, in your medicine cabinet, to avoid that, okay? But I'm just saying how things evolve. There are ways to dispose of drugs. So this is something, I've got a box in the back. Anybody who wants to go in the back until they run out, y'all can pick up one of these. It's a form of destroying the drugs that are left over so that they don't get into the wrong hands. The other thing was mentioned already by Dr. Roy is Narcan. This is a lifesaver. It's a simple little nasal spray, okay, that if somebody's out, okay, call 911, okay, try to wake them, when they wake in, it seems like they can't breathe properly, okay, and you suspect the least amount. By the way, if you happen to be wrong and it's not an overdose, it won't hurt them if you administer it, okay? But I'd call 911 first, I'd get them in the right position, and I would spray this in their nose, and you have a chance to revive them. I bought a few here, didn't have a whole bunch of them, okay, but we got 10 or 12 here, and if anybody, if you have one in your house, don't go for another one, okay? But if you don't, you can take one of the ones we got until they run out. The other thing is, I do believe we need more education in schools. Me and my wife advocated for many years to try to have a class in school, half credit or full credit school, mandatory in high school, so that if you don't pass this, you don't graduate. And the other thing I'd like to recommend is make sure you talk to your kids. Okay? See, everybody in this room here came here for a reason, okay? And I'm glad y'all here. Really appreciate y'all being here. But it's the people that aren't here the message and maybe not paying attention. So when you leave here, please, please spread the messages that we all deliver here. Talk to other families, talk to other kids, talk to other parents, talk to other students. Make sure you make that aware. And then the other thing that we need to do is, the world is different now because of fentanyl. Dr. Roy mentioned that. It's different for a lot of reasons, okay? And the really evil people, you know, people prefer to take pills than take injections. Very few people take injections. Now all of a sudden they put fentanyl in pills. Yes, they put it in cocaine. Yes, they put it in hard drugs, okay? But they put it in pills. People many times think they take in a pill. They think they take in a prescription medication that you could have got at a pharmacy, but they're not getting it at a pharmacy, and it is fentanyl. And we call that one pill kills. You know, I had the privilege since the documentary broke to speak in really in front of big audiences in prestigious places. Okay, I spoke before the American Pharmaceutical Association. I spoke to this RX Summit where drug czars and presidents speak and senators speak and all this kind of stuff, okay? But probably the most important talk I gave was at a middle school down in St. Bernard Parish. Maybe about 6 months, 9 months ago, I don't exactly remember when. And this was pretty much the speech. Okay? Parents and students, please be alert and aware that there are fake prescription pills such as Xanax, Percocet, and Adderall on the street and available through social media. These fake pills contain deadly amounts of the very potent opioid called fentanyl. One pill can kill. This fentanyl can also release ecstasy, marijuana, methamphetamine, almost any drug. Never take anything unless it is prescribed by a doctor and gotten from a pharmacy. In the past, experimenting with these things was wrong, but not usually deadly. Now this illicit fentanyl is in almost anything, not from a pharmacy, and is killing students. It is truly like playing Russian roulette. You know, I used to speak in schools 20 years ago after my son died, and you know, I was beyond to just say no phase. But I did want to try to really, really almost scare these kids into not taking drugs, okay? Maybe that's not quite the way you got to educate them into not doing drugs, okay? And maybe give them other options, okay? But in any event, I had a little thing, I called it Russian roulette back then. And there was a little hyperbole in that. I actually felt a little mixed about that in my exaggerating. And most of the kids in the audience, they kind of knew I was exaggerating because they were already doing some of these drugs, okay? And it didn't kill them. Maybe didn't even know that they killed one of their friends, okay? There's a big difference in that. Unfortunately, that story I told is not real. Because now one pill does kill. One joint can kill. One dose of anything can kill. So we have to spread this message, and we got to get serious about selling. No, this isn't just, the old days when you could maybe experiment and maybe you could get through it. Maybe you wouldn't become addicted, okay? Some did, okay? There's still a wrong thing to do. Now there is a danger out there. We got to make everybody aware of that. So talk to you kids, definitely, okay? The other thing I'd like y'all to do is become advocates. Learn, do what you can do to watch your own kids, tell your friends, tell your family, but call your senators, call your representatives. There's going to be money coming this way, and this money's got to be directed in a correct way, like Dr. Roy mentioned, and I mentioned. Supposedly, I, as the pharmacist now, am sort of the gatekeeper of some of the money that comes in. I got to wait to see if they really listen to me, okay? But in any of that, phone calls occasionally to say, we have to do something about this one pill kills. We got to do something to curtail this fentanyl. We got to do something to get better treatment, get people, we got to do something to make Suboxone more available than OxyContin or Vicodin, okay? We got to do something to save our kids. Some of the organizations that I am a part of right now, they really call this genocide. I think they kind of move hyperbole there, that a slight exaggeration is different definitions of genocide. But it is true that we lose most people to addictions right now because of fentanyl, because of one pill kills. Most of the people that are dying are really starts at 15 years of age. And actually it slows down after they maybe 30 or 35. So you're not just losing people like in COVID. We lost people and it was horrible. A mouthful, whatever we can do, but most of the people that died were over 50 years of age. Many of them over 70 years of age. When we losing kids that have a whole life ahead, many times they've already gotten married, okay, and they got 2 kids, and now grandpa's raising the kids, okay, or they become orphans basically, and they foster kids. So take it seriously, and please speak up. Please speak up. And talk to your kids. I just want to make sure, too, that we realize the magnitude of the problem. Okay? There's a couple different analogies. By the way, fentanyl is so potent, okay, that just like a couple of grains of salt is, I think it's 2 milligrams? 2 micrograms, okay? I mean, this is ridiculous on how much it takes to maybe kill something. But also, when you lose 105,000 people, that's almost 300 a day. Just think, when an airplane crashes, just what happens? It's all over the media, isn't it? Every day we see it on the media. Okay, it's a big deal. They have all kinds of investigations. What caused it? That is happening every day in the drug situation. And we really need to get more attention on this problem. Okay? We're too good of a country, and we're losing a lot of our youth. So we definitely have to get that in. Another thing that we in Louisiana can relate to too, okay? Tiger Stadium holds almost 100,000 people. They call it Death Valley. You could fill it with the overdose death in bodies. Think about that. That stadium from top to bottom full of people that overdosed and died. Most of whom were between 15 and say 35 years of age. There's always hope. We have to pray. If we can encourage people to get the spiritual element involved, whatever their religion is, found God. I can tell you God helped me along the way. Okay? I made a promise to him that if I could solve my son's murder, I would go on a mission for him. And my mission was to try to save other families from the tragedy that had befallen my family. And every day I try to do that. God bless y'all, and speak up.
All right, thank you, Dan. We really, really appreciate what you've done. I want to reiterate what he said, because it's overwhelming when you sit here and you listen to all this. I know it's overwhelming, but what he finished on, the power of prayer, I can't emphasize that enough. It's why I went to school at the seminary to learn the theology, because you're a body and you have a soul. And unfortunately, with addiction causes the body to rule the soul, when God designed you so that your soul would illuminate your body. And the only way I know around that is to develop a relationship with God. And luckily tonight we have a Catholic priest here, a wonderful gentleman who stands in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. So when he's up here talking, you're actually hearing from a representative of Jesus Christ. And our church, the Catholic Church, has the wonderful sacraments, the greatest toolbox, I think, in the world, because I've watched how that's healed my oldest son, how it's helped me. These graces pour forth from the sacraments, which build spiritual muscle, which helps strengthen the soul and strengthen your will to want to live. Because you can take all the medicine in the world, you can go to recovery programs, but if you don't have that extra push that God gives you, sometimes you just can't make it on your own, because we're weak as humans. So please welcome Father Beau Charbonnet. He's been a pastor here for 9 years. He's an amazing human being and priest.
Good evening. Okay, when I say the word ambulance chaser, what kind of occupation do you think of? Attorney, right. I'm not an attorney, but I'm an ambulance chaser. Explain this. In my parish, when a person is in distress, that requires a hospitalization, we hear an ambulance come through. And when I hear them, I try to chase them down within the neighborhood, get them anointed. 9 times out of 10, they are parishioners or people I can minister to and talk to. There was one particular day about 6 years ago that I will never forget, though, when I heard an ambulance come down right down my street. I was in my house and I heard it right outside, and I knew it was right nearby. I got outside, looked down the block, and I saw lights on at a home maybe 10 to 12 houses down on my block of Melody Drive. I went down there, and when I walked in, the wife that I'd seen before came to me and she said, "Father, come on in." Walked inside, and her husband was basically on the floor, and he was out. And the wife was on her knees, the people in the house were on their knees, and paramedics were actively working on him. And I'll never forget, they administered Narcan, and I watched this guy pop up, come to life. I was like, okay, see Jesus raising people from the dead? I watched a guy pop up like this. And it was just so amazing to see him pop up alert and aware, and as those receptors were shut down, and it just it seemed like a miracle. And it is a miracle. It's a miracle how God works through modern medicine. But I saw this guy and I'm thinking, man, this guy almost lost his life. As a priest, I've also been in situations where I've seen people that have lost their lives, where heroin and fentanyl have come together, and I've seen young women, young men that have died, buried them. It's a very hard thing. When you see these families that are sitting there feeling so utterly out of control, wanting to go back in time and capture a moment and go, if only I would have been there. And yet it's impossible to go back to that. And watching grief, the utter pain and the destruction of it, and the heartache of that, and the follow-up of that. I've seen those families healed. There's a family in this room right now that is healed to the point of becoming ministers of great, great grace to reach out to others. Billy and William Hunt back there, they lost their daughter Chelsea. And now they're in a ministry called Compassion Friends that has done amazing, amazing work to reach out. And they're here tonight too. But God takes tragic situations and he makes something beautiful. The mess becomes a message. The test becomes a testimony. How God just clears things up. I was saying, you look at in history, the worst thing that ever happened was that God walked the earth when he nailed him to a cross. But he took the worst event that ever happened and he made it something beautiful. He made it the resurrection. And he enabled us to rise again, to go through hard things and make it great. Almost like if you look at a pendulum, come down like this, bad things, good things. We think of the awful things that happen in life over here, and the great things that happen in life over here. The worst thing, again, from a Catholic perspective, Christian perspective, is, again, the death of Jesus, all the way up here at 12 o'clock. But if you could take that and make it the greatest thing, that means that everything in that path can get scooped up and made beautiful and great. Beautiful and great. Louis Bauer. Where's Louis? Louis, right here. I've known Louis for some time, since 2002, when I did an internship at St. Margaret Mary years ago as a deacon. And around 2011, I was over at his parish, and he was mentioning that he was starting a substance addiction ministry. He was starting out of Florida. He said, it's a great thing because the Catholic Church has nothing like this in Louisiana, a place for people to land. And I'm thinking, wow, this is great. And Louis said, you know, when you get to your parish in Merici, there's nothing like that in Merici. Maybe you can start it in Merici. And go, yeah, we'll do this. And you get busy, and it's easy to put things off. I remember one day there was a parishioner that, under the influence, did something incredibly horrible, and it ended up kind of resolving in his own death. He took the life of somebody else, and then he was killed in the whole process. And Louis came around at that point, and we were thinking at that point, okay, he goes, when am I going to start this? And Pope Francis was in town at that point in the States, and he talked about just reaching out to people in need. And Pope Francis was beautiful in really reaching out to those in utter need. I said, Louis, let's do this now. And I prayed about it. I said, who in my parish could facilitate this? Because I know as a pastor, you got a lot going on, and I got incredible deacons here. Deacon David Aaron. God put David on my heart. And I talked to David. I said, David, would you be interested in doing this? And David said, all right. Not knowing at all what he was getting into. And I watched God provide. Lisa Carroll, another parishioner and school parent, where's Lisa right over here, who of course is an addiction counselor, jumped in, and other people got in. And suddenly, this whole ministry started taking off. We became a place to land and network, and it became great. And it's so great just as a pastor, when somebody comes to you and says, look, I am struggling with addiction, I can say, look, let's talk. I want to walk with you, accompany with you spiritually. At the same time, I got a ministry that can really help deal with the immediate need and get the help you need. So let's do this together. Let's do this. We started doing that for people that are struggling with addiction. At the same time, those that have someone in their family. Those afflicted and those affected. But ultimately, we find out those affected really do get afflicted by pulling in the whole system itself. And everyone's involved. And everyone needs healing. And that's what we're here for. I always say when I do marriage prep, that if you do not have Jesus in the middle of your marriage, you will end up worshiping your spouse. You will try to get absolution, consolation, strength, healing from that person. That person can't do it. In fact, you'll drain them out to the point that you'll end up in divorce. You'll objectify them and use them for something they're not equipped to give. But ultimately, when God is in the center, you come to each other as a wellspring, giving back and forth. The time that you're dry, the other will pour out. And when the other's dry, you will pour out. And that spiritual connection is so vital in marriage, but it's just a great analogy at the same time for our own lives. No substance can possibly give us what God does. And when he gives, it's incredible. You know, years ago when I was teaching, I taught high school at Rummel High School. And like I said, I've buried students before that I've known, and it seemed, man, if only I could have been at that point, track with them along their lives. But while I was teaching, during the summer as a teacher, I wanted to get some, just financially, I wanted to support what I was doing. And I worked as a psych tech at DePaul Hospital, and actually, met Dr. Roy years ago. We were just kind of reconnecting. This was from the mid-1990s. I remember working in various units to do with adult long-term, adolescent long-term, and also chemical dependency unit. And then that chemical dependency unit, they asked me one night, said, can you take some of our patients over to a meeting? And I remember taking them over to a meeting on St. Charles Avenue in the basement. It was a Presbyterian church. And I walked in, and it was an open meeting, so I could be there. And I just remember feeling the presence of God in such a remarkable way. And I came away thinking, wow, everybody here has got it. And Joy Planet doesn't have it. In the sense that if we do not have deep spiritual connection, deep community connection, we'll be addicted to something. It could be Amazon, it could be a cell phone, it could be a person, so many things trying to fill that gap. But if God and community are not there, this is where we will end up by default. And I learned just a lot, about the 12 steps, beginning with that process. And how basically we all need them. And the whole church needs them. In many ways, there's a lot of so many healings are going on, in rooms of AA, NA, you name it, NEA, out there. It's amazing how much healing and how much transformation is happening there. And we as a church have got to get on the stick and realize the utter power of this. And this is our offering of it. I remember about 5 years ago watching a show called Dope. It was a documentary, I believe, on Netflix. Who has seen that by chance? Okay. It came from 3 perspectives, looking at the user, looking at the dealer, and looking at law enforcement. And I'll never forget watching, they were interviewing one of the dealers. They were very honest, very candid. And they asked them, they said, because the fentanyl really started to hit at that point, so many people were dying with the fentanyl lacing. And they talked to this guy and they said, how do you feel? Your conscience, how do you feel realizing that the people are dying from your product? And the guy very casually said, he goes, well, sometimes, he said, his quote was, you got to kill a fiend or two in order to get your product out there and known. And I realized that, wow. Number one, I was shocked at the fact that the dealer had said that his conscience was so dull that he was able to say that. But at the same time, I was also shocked at the fact that when people hear about death on the street, they run out to it. And I realized that's the power of addiction. A person thinking that they could somehow surf that line and not die, but ride it. And that's, again, where we all come in, as church, to recognize that, we cannot, wash our hands of this. We've got to be engaged. We've got to meet people with love and compassion. What I love is in the confessional. And I heard someone say at one point, they said, if the whole world went to confession, you'd see a lot of the business of psychiatry and psychology kind of fall to the wayside. Because that removal of shame is so important. And the removal of shame happens so much, in these rooms, the 12-step rooms. It happens at our substance addiction ministry. It happens in confessional. In the confessional, I get to stand on the front lines of watching a person freed up from being locked in shame for years. And the power of that is just amazing. It's like seeing a weight being lifted off a person's shoulders and just being gone. And anything we can do with the sacraments or as church to support, we're here to do. We have seen our group grow, right, Dave? Yes, and minister to so many different people. We've seen people come in. We've seen people also pass away too. Those are hard losses. We've seen people walk in and walk out. But nonetheless, we're here. I talked to somebody at a wedding recently. This man who was in recovery, he said he went to treatment 15 times. But after 15 times, he finally got it. And I was like, dude, your perseverance is incredible. And I'm going to share your witness to other people to let them know. So sometimes it's number 16 that does it. But don't give up. Many families say, well, my son, my daughter's been in treatment 3 times. I'm ready to wash my hands of them. Don't give up. Let's work together. And we are, I said, as our ministry, we're kind of wide-ranging. But again, it's wide-ranging to bring it down to a funnel, to find out where the funnel spills out for you and your situation. But we are here. So with that, thank you all for being here. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, your openness, and we're here for you. Again, tonight, if you're in a situation where you do need help, do not leave this room, please, this room of great healing, without talking to somebody. Do something different. Amen.
Thank you, Father Beau. We're going to open up for questions now, if you have any questions. But I'd like to ask Father Beau a real quick question. And I wanted to tell you, the community that my oldest son went to was a 3-year program. There are some parents in the back, the LaForges, and they're going to be sitting at a table, Hope Reborn, I don't know where it is, and they'll answer questions. And it's a free program, 3 years. You don't pay anything. But it's based on the sacramental life of the church. When Johnny, my oldest son, was in town from Liberia, he's a missionary now in Liberia, West Africa, he gave a testimony at your church, and he said that the paradigm shift, he was in recovery, and he was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning with some of his friends in the community, because that was the hour a lot of guys and gals were on the streets, and praying for them. And he said, after he had done that for a long period, suddenly there was a paradigm shift in his recovery and his relationship with God, because he was sitting before the Blessed Sacrament. How would you explain that to someone as a priest, what took place inside of him? Because it's not a tangible thing you can touch.
No. It's nothing short of miraculous in the sense of, yes, nothing short of miraculous in the sense that our eyes get opened and we get that gap filled in our heart, that the God-sized hole in the heart gets filled by Him, which enables us to see. And it says, without that being filled, we're desperate and nearsighted. But when the gap is filled, there's something that just transforms. I think we're able to see other people outside of ourselves. I think Dr. Roy talked about self-centeredness. And that narcissism can kick in with all of us. But when that is really touched in a different way, we begin to look outside of ourselves. And I think that's part of it.
All right. We can take questions from the audience. Lisa has a microphone. Where do you go
to get Narcan for free in this area?
You can get Narcan at any pharmacy, but if you walk in, they'll give it to you. You may have to pay for it if your insurance doesn't. There are some distribution sites. I know that there's a needle exchange program that meets downtown, and they can distribute Narcan. I think that everybody who knows anybody who uses needles should have a Narcan on them, a Narcan in their glove compartment, and a Narcan in their medicine cabinet.
Jefferson Parish had a program that don't know if they run out of it or not, but they will, a couple fire stations.
There's a list actually. So University Medical Center distributed a flyer. They have overdose rescue packs for community distribution at fire stations in Orleans, Jefferson, and St. Bernard. It's not at every one, but there is a flyer that we can distribute through SAM if anybody's interested. The Narcan is free and it's under a grant.
All right, check with that lady. She's got a bunch of different sites, but I do know Jefferson. I went on Channel 8 and talked about Jefferson's program with
I think Jefferson Parish Human Services District, they have it. I was trained through their grant. Somebody came to my home and about 5 of us were trained. And Metropolitan Human Services District, they might be doing that as well. Anybody else have questions for our guest? Yeah.
They both carry Narcan in their car.
Right.
Might be because I'm in recovery and I work in it, but I'm very hyper-vigilant to, if you're out with a bunch of friends, you know, and I've explained to them, you still have to call an ambulance, but this might save their life for 5-10 minutes before the ambulance gets there. So,
Right.
harm reduction, I think if you have kids, Florida Parish Services in St. Tammany Fire Station still have. Yeah, most fire stations, you walk in and you just get one. You don't, all you make, you sign a paper. It doesn't have to be your real name. It's just sign it.
I'd like to ask any of the vendors that we have here tonight who has Narcan with them tonight to be able to give out. Raise your hand, please. If you're looking for Narcan to bring home, here's some of the vendors. Raise your hand that you can pick it up this evening.
And Google on the internet. You can find all kinds of things on the internet. It's true. All right.
Yes, ma'am. How long, on the medical side of it, how long does it take for like the brain to actually recover from drug use?
That depends on the drug used, the length of time that the drug's been used, and it's very individual. So in order to completely detox from a drug like methadone, it probably takes 6 weeks. If somebody's been using fentanyl, you have to remember that even though fentanyl used in the operating room is a very short-acting drug, most of the fentanyl that gets injected gets stored in your fat, and then it gets released over a long period of time. So it takes about 3 months to get completely through detox on fentanyl. Now, you know, there are studies that show that people who drink alcohol every day for 20 years still have impairment a year later. That's improving, but it's still there. So it's very individualized. It very much depends on the drug that's been used. And it also depends on how the withdrawal is managed, because there are ways to precipitate withdrawal and make it get over with real quick.
All right, and another question. What is your recommendation on the Sublocade shot?
I love Sublocade. I think it's the solution. I think it not only does away with the idea of diversion, because you can't take it out of you once it's in you. But it slowly releases over a period of time, so that if for some reason you should stop Sublocade, it continues to release for up to a year if you've been on it for more than 6 months. And so, you know, the problem of having access to it is not really a problem in Louisiana, because all insurance companies will pay for it. So I think it's really the solution. Once somebody is stable on Suboxone for 6 weeks, they should go on Sublocade.
Thank you.
I got a question on Kratom. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but is it addictive, and how does it affect you in the long run?
I'm sorry, I'm kind of hearing impaired.
It's a opioid called Kratom,
Yeah,
and people are using
I'm
it a
very,
lot.
very familiar with it. In Louisiana, it's not even illegal. You can buy it at
Right.
gas stations and stuff. But Kratom at low doses is a stimulant at high doses. It's an opiate. When somebody's been using Kratom every day for a while, they have exactly the same kind of withdrawal as they do from opiates.
Thank you.
On the question about Kratom, it is addictive. And it works. It's an opiate, and it does. Very addictive. It is, it's an opiate. It is just like taking anything. And after a while, you increase higher and higher dose until, and you go through the withdrawals just like you would any opiate. I have a recovering daughter of Kratom and benzo mixed together, and it just about killed her. So, yes, opiate is addictive form.
I have a nephew who came to me before Christmas sometime, and he said, "Aunt Karen, I want to get straight. I want to go to get treatment." And I showed him the telephone and the computer. I said, "Find a place and we'll bring you there," you know. But he backed up and didn't go. He said, "Well, maybe I need a meeting." That didn't work. My husband saw us for a meeting, and half an hour later, he's walking to the door and somebody brought him home. My question is, when I was at the frazzle again of his coming and going and this commotion, I asked my brother, who was his dad, I said, "Wow, why don't you commit him?" And he said, "Sis, I have 3 times, but they keep him for 38 hours, 42 hours, whatever it was, and they let him go." So I don't know if the commitment is any facilitating at all, you know, but I'm wondering what would be an approach to that if they keep just getting committed and then getting out.
So if I understand the question is, your question is committing an adolescent effective?
He's 35.
So there are several laws in Louisiana that can be implemented. One is physician's emergency certificate followed by coroner's emergency certificate, which will get somebody with addiction either 15 or 28 days in a treatment process. And there are some rules about how to go about that and so forth, but it has to start with a physician. But with somebody who has a record of repeated unsuccessful treatments and a behavior that makes them a danger to themselves or a danger to others, or gravely disabled while they're using and they can't stop using, they may be a candidate for a judicial commitment. And there are two kinds of judicial commitments as I understand it. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that there's two. And one will commit somebody to a residential facility, and then there's an outpatient commitment that will commit the adolescent to go where they're supposed to go, where their guardian tells them they're supposed to go, and if they don't, then the police come and take them there. So there's several legal avenues that are open, and it's a good source of information is NAMI, N-A-M-I. Okay, just get in contact with them, and they are a very good resource.
When you said fentanyl is individualized to a person, we lost our daughter 6 years ago to an accidental overdose of fentanyl. She was suffering with scoliosis and decided to buy it. Somebody said, this will help your pain, and it took her life. So it was just that one time, and she's gone now. So you never know what you're buying off the street. Like you said, you don't know what you're buying. Everything's either crushed, pilled, in a needle. So I just wanted to say that, you know, it's rough out there, guys, you know.
You never can tell what you're going to get from the street when you buy drugs on the street. And the toxicology screens for people who have died from an overdose this year have had an average of 5 different drugs, any one of which could have been fatal.
I'd just like to ask if there's a national support number that's available in case you have family members and yourself, and sometimes you just need a little support or a little hope. Is there a number that you can call to get this, or would anybody know?
You know, I'm really not knowledgeable about that. There are lots of places you can call. The state has places you can call, and various treatment centers have places you can call. There's suicide hotlines, and I don't have the information to refer you, but standing next to me is a preventionist who may have that information.
Well, I think what he told you, I don't know the number myself. There's a lady in the back, but I know that if you call JPHSA, Jefferson Parish Human Services District, and Metropolitan Human Services in New Orleans, and if you Google it, hotline number, I'm telling you, I love Google for this fact, that you can find almost anything on there, and they'll have 1-800 numbers on there for you. It's somebody to talk to. Yes, ma'am. Families? Okay. Right. And you know, there's also NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They put out the latest information, NIDA. If you Google that, you can find some resources there. SAMHSA is another one, a national organization. Even if you Google the RX Summit, where we were all trained every year, they'll have information on there where you can go for help. So there's lots of stuff on the websites.
If you all want to sign up to get my emails, in my signature line, I have a lot of those links, a lot of the SAMHSAs. Remember this, 211. It's via link. It's a resource. You call them, you tell them, I'm having a financial problem, I'm having an overdose problem, I'm having an issue with trying to find resources for addiction. And they have a plethora of information that they give. They're constantly building and building and building this database. So you tell them what your specific need is, and the operators there will give you the necessary information and resources. So 211. It's almost like information is 411. This is 211 for information on resources like that.
Right.
This question is for Dr. Roy. I know we've been talking about substance abuse and drug addiction, but curious, in your research with genetic contributions and hereditary, things like that, with process addictions like sexual addiction, gambling addiction, things like that, do you see any kind of similar like genetic contributions? Is this hereditary or is this a different beast? Thanks.
Exactly. They run in the same families. The genetics are the same. The genetics that have to do with addiction all impact the dopamine reward system and results in a low dopamine tone, which is associated with feeling less than. And so how somebody addresses that by creating a dopamine spike, either with behavior or with drugs, it's the same disease. And the genetics that have to do with addiction also have to do with carbohydrate addiction, sexual addiction, addiction to power. There's a number of different behavioral addictions, gambling, that are part of that same disease. And we're on the verge of being able to test for that genetically and be able to predict somebody having difficulty with addiction when they're children, and also being able to identify how difficult it will be for a person to get well after they go to treatment or become abstinent. And so we're on the cusp of a brave new world of personalized, individualized medicine, where we're actually going to be able to do something about some of those genetic deficits.
I want to ask a question, and I don't want to open up a can of worms on this, but I want to ask what your thoughts were on the prison system and rehabilitation, especially for prisoners who are suffering from addiction. Because a lot of times with drug court or programs like reentry, they're just remanded back to jail once they relapse. They may get like maybe 1 or 2 tries, they go to rehab, didn't work out, they switch to a different program, and some of the rehabs aren't really good for them, honestly. So I want to ask what your thoughts are on that, how we can advocate for better treatment options for these inmates whose criminality is addiction, and instead of having judges just send them to jail for 10, 20 years, how we could improve the treatment process for inmates.
So that's a very good and also a very complex question. Addiction treatment grew up in silos. So there was one silo where addiction was treated like a sin, and the solution was religion. There's one silo where treatment was, or addiction was antisocial behavior. And the treatment was to force people to be pro-social. And then there's another treatment silo that it was more holistic, that looked at addiction as a disease that preceded use and that was influenced by childhood or developmental traumas. And so what I would recommend is that you avoid the first two silos and that you look for treatment that is trauma-informed and also treatment that is 12-step oriented. If you find a place that's trauma-informed and 12-step oriented, there's a good chance that's a good treatment center. There's also, there's a rating organization called Shatterproof, and their rating system is called Atlas, and you can Google Atlas or Shatterproof Atlas, and you will get a list of treatment centers that are graded by their ability to be trauma-informed and follow the American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria for proper treatment.
Okay, I think that's someone has one more question. We're going to go ahead and let you all loose. We have a lot of food here for you all. We didn't want you to come here and not feed you, so we have food here. So while you're sitting here snacking on the food, we'd like to ask you to do it like Father Beau said, don't leave this room without getting the resources you came for. Find the information, get informed of what is available out there. The bags are in the back. You can load the bags up, take it home, look at it, open it up, you have time to read it, then you can call the people. Ask the questions to the individual place that are here today. We have 37 total resources here tonight. We have 20 addiction treatment facilities from the front of the room to the back of the room. Around the perimeter, there's treatment facilities. Then we have the 12-step groups. We have interventionists back here. We have some sober living houses. So find out your information. Now's the time to do it. This like before, a long time ago when I was little, the doctors used to go to the house, make house calls. Doesn't happen anymore, but if in a way, we have the professional, the doctors, so to speak, that come here to help with your healing. So don't leave here without finding the information out that you came for. I think this is just about it. Would you like to wrap up, Father, with a prayer? Mary?
All right. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, again. Okay, Heavenly Father, again, make this place a place of healing tonight, and people make connections before they leave. And we thank you again, just for Dr. Roy, for Dan, for Mary Lou, and for Louie, and just for everyone who's participating here tonight. May all their ministries truly be blessed in so many ways. May Almighty God bless us all, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's thank everybody for coming out tonight.
Of Long Branch, Wood Lake, Beacon, and nobody showed up for that. So definitely, we'll just go down.